you. Great. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. So excited to have you here. My name is Alan Price. I'm director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and we are celebrating the 50th anniversary year of the moon landing. Yes, exactly right. A particularly aspirational goal that President Kennedy led our country to achieve. And we are, throughout this year, celebrating bold innovation, calls to courage, calls to service, and can we go for something bolder? And in that spirit, we're particularly excited to host this morning's conversation. I'm here with my colleague, Stephen Rothstein, director of the Kennedy Library Foundation. I'll let him say a few words here.
Thank you, Alan. We are humbled that all of you are here, and those watching online also want to welcome you. I also have two special guests that will be introduced more formally later in just a minute, but we're really humbled that both of you are here, and each of you individually have done such incredible work and continue to do such important work. Our society is better because of your efforts. I also want to recognize a member of our board, Matt Kennedy. Appreciate Matt's contribution. Matt, please recognize. Thank you, Matt. Zero Mass Water's 21st century moonshot to make fresh drinking water and unlimited resources around the world can inspire and activate each of us, just as what President Kennedy did, as Alan talked about, over 50 years ago. To hear more about that, I want to introduce Todd Hines, the CEO and founder of XL Fleet, and a senior lecturer at MIT who teaches energy ventures and co-founded the MIT Clean Energy Prize and is a Boston-based leader to address key environmental issues. Todd?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the JFK Library for hosting this special event highlighting innovation and its impact on humanity. As was mentioned this year, the Presidential Library is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. The JFK moonshot speech was an opportunity to unite around advancements in technology and human achievement. It also ignited and guided 400,000 people to work tirelessly for almost a decade to solve an immense technical challenge. In that speech, President Kennedy famously said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Today, we are fortunate to hear about one of those other things that President Kennedy alluded to. We get to hear about something that will have a lasting and positive impact on the world by solving a very hard challenge. According to the World Health Organization, at least 2 billion people use drinking water sources contaminated with feces, resulting in almost 500,000 deaths per year. As if that wasn't bad enough, by 2025, half the world's population will be living in water-stressed areas, and climate change will make this problem much worse. Fortunately, we have innovators like Dr. Cody Friesen, who's here and is passionate about solving the world's greatest challenges. As an entrepreneur and material scientist, Cody builds businesses that apply advanced technologies to problems facing humanity. He is driven by creating technology for social equity. In 2014, Cody and his team of scientists commercialized a technology they were developing for over 8 years at the ASU Fulton Schools of Engineering. This technology became Source, a hydro panel that makes clean drinking water from air, independent of infrastructure. The core product offering of Zero Mass Water. He is a Fulton Engineering Professor of Innovation at Arizona State University and is a Senior Sustainability Scientist at the ASU Global Institute for Sustainability. Cody has always been driven by the power of science to solve real problems and was named by the Aspen Institute as a 2015 Henry Crown Fellow. In 2009, MIT's Technology Review named him as one of the top 35 innovators in the world under the age of 35. Cody has led Zero Mass Water to be recognized with the CES Innovation Award in 2008, and is a New Energy Pioneer by Bloomberg New Energy Finance in 2019. He's previously served as the U.S. Manufacturing Counsel for the U.S. Department of Commerce as the co-chair of the Energy Subcommittee. He has 145 patents, 145 patent matters around the world, and 37 granted patents already. Cody earned a BSc in Material Science and Engineering from Arizona State University and a PhD in the same discipline from MIT. And because this is a private group, which means no tweeting, no commenting, can't say anything about this, I can share with you that tomorrow Cody will be publicly honored with the 2019 Lemelson MIT Award for his work as an inventor. So a special round of applause. It's an amazing award, and everyone here, I think, really appreciates the work that you do. Thank you. Cody and Zero Mass are truly positioned to change the world. And who better to have a seaside chat with than someone who has already changed the world? We are thrilled to have Secretary Albright joining Cody for this conversation today. Madeleine Albright is chair of the Albright-Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm, and chair of Albright Capital Management, an investment advisory firm focused on emerging markets. In 1997, Dr. Albright was named as the first female Secretary of State and became the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government, a record that stood for nearly 10 years. As Secretary of State, Dr. Albright reinforced America's alliances, advocated for democracy and human rights, and promoted American trade, business, labor, and environmental standards abroad. Dr. Albright served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and was a member of the President's Cabinet. Dr. Albright is a professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Services. She chairs the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs and serves as president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation. She serves on the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Policy Board, as well as the board of the Aspen Institute. Dr. Albright's latest book, called Fascism, A Warning, is a recent New York Times #1 bestseller. She's the author of 5 other New York Times bestsellers, including her autobiography, Madam Secretary, a memoir. In recognition for her amazing achievements, Dr. Albright received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, from President Obama. Dr. Albright received master's and doctorate degrees from Columbia University, and she's based in Washington, but she did spend some time in the Boston area, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts with honors from Wellesley College, a college whose mission is to educate women who will change the world. And I think it's safe to say they succeeded in this case. So let's now welcome Secretary Madeleine Albright and Dr. Cody Friesen to the stage.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ted. Thank you.
All right.
Wow. So excited to be here with so many people that we love. And Todd, thank you for that very kind introduction. You're a gentleman and a phenomenal entrepreneur. And Secretary Albright, really excited to be here with you. And it's always such a delight to spend time with you, and I cherish our friendship. So the idea that Secretary and I had here was to have a little bit of a back and forth, and the concept is, usually when you have a couple people talking to a group of people, they're technologists, or they're diplomats, or they're fill in the blank. But here we have a juxtaposition of a woman who has operated in the realms of statecraft and in diplomacy, and you have me as a technologist, and this idea that we can change the world maybe in a fundamentally different way if we put those two things together. And so let's get going. So as we've been talking about already several times this morning, President Kennedy in his moonshot speech talked about not only going to the moon, but the other things also, and talked about doing those things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And of course, I think everybody in the room will agree that he was motivating far beyond just going to the moon. And talking, I think, ultimately why some people are attracted to solving what is seemingly impossible. And so you've done many, many hard things, some by choice, maybe some by not by choice. Maybe we could start by you telling us about an area where you attacked the problem precisely because it was hard.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here with you, Cody, and to have a chance to have this conversation, and congratulations on the award. I've kept it a secret now ever since you told me in Aspen, and some of the conversations that we've had really made me want to come and spend this time with you, because I think that the things that you've done are remarkable, and I look forward to having a discussion about it. So my hard thing is going to be, I think, strange for people to immediately understand, but it was leaving Europe and coming to America and becoming an American, because what happened was that I was born just before World War II. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and when the Nazis marched into Czechoslovakia, he was able to escape with my mother and me, and we went to England. And so I spent my childhood in air raid shelters. We were in London during the Blitz, and sang 100 Green Bottles hanging on the wall. And I would go to school in between air raid sirens. I played a refugee child for the Red Cross. And then what happened after the war, my father went back to Czechoslovakia, and then he was made ambassador to Yugoslavia. And then the communists took over, and we came to the United States. And so the hard part for me was trying to figure out where I lived, what language I should speak, how I should behave. And so coming to America was my moonshot. There's just no question about it. And it made a huge difference in every single way. And I have to say, the whole concept and the being of President Kennedy was just one of the stunning aspects. And one of the things you were talking about at Wellesley, what happened was he was running for the Senate at that time, and he came out to Wellesley. We all obviously fell in love. And my job, I was a journalist. I was covering him, and so I wrote a story about his coming, but then I asked for his autograph. And what happened was my about-to-be husband said, "How totally unprofessional of you to ask for an autograph when you're doing an interview." And I said, "That may be true, but I still to this day have the autograph." The thing about it, and I want to expand on this a bit, is because we moved to Chicago. I was there during the 1960 campaign, and the great parades and everything that happened. So for me, the greatest thing is becoming an American, and my first vote was for John Kennedy in Chicago. It was counted many times, and so, but it really, and then we moved to Washington when he was president, and so it really, to be in Washington during Camelot and to listen to that inaugural speech and to know what the atmosphere was really like. So I'm delighted to, and thank you. I continue to admire the Kennedy family in every way, and I admire very, very much all the things that you're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate that. How about when, maybe while you were Secretary of State, there's lots of things coming at you, I'm sure. One of those things, maybe something that you attacked because it was, a particularly pernicious problem or something hard. You just saw, you didn't see anybody else picking it up, and you went after it.
Well, the thing that I did, and I'm proudest of it, but it was the hardest thing to do, was to make a difference in what was going on with ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And it's interesting in terms of how one's history affects what you think and how you act. And having told my story of having to leave when communists took over, and when during World War II people were sent to concentration camps, I could see what was going on in Kosovo, where people were being killed, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. And I I'd always been interested in the former Yugoslavia. As I said, my father had been ambassador there. And so the idea was what to do. And thanks, I think, to a lot of the inspiration from President Kennedy, knowing what, in fact, America could and should do as a world leader, that people listen and wonder what we're going to do. And so the question was, what are you all going to do about Kosovo? And I had been disturbed, frankly, about how long it took us to do something about Bosnia. And then I'm Secretary of State, and I thought, all right, it is up to me to really move this forward. So I did say that we were going to use American power to stop the killing there. So the Secretary of State can say many things, but has no airplanes. So the bottom line is I had to persuade, the hardest part about it was persuading our own government. And so I met with the Secretary of Defense, and we talked about this, and the military people said, no, we can't do this. And I said, we do really have to do it, and we argued a lot. And then we went in front of the president, and the president agreed with me that we needed to do something. And so, but it wasn't simple even then. What happened, President calls me in the middle of the night, and he said, Madeleine, the planes have left. This is the right thing we're doing, right? Yes, Mr. President. Madeleine, it is the right thing. Yes, absolutely, Mr. President. So then what happens is that the weather was bad. The Serbs put out decoys. And then I come into my office a couple of days later, and my exec says, sit down. I said, what's the matter with you? He said, just sit down. I said, seriously? He said, we've just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake. So what happened was this glorious thing was called Madeleine's War. When we won it, it was called something else. But the bottom line is I did feel personally responsible, but I do think the wonderful end to this story, this summer in June was the 20th anniversary of all of that, and I went to Kosovo with President Clinton. And I have never been to a place that was so grateful to America. There were American flags everywhere, people yelling, thank you, USA. And it was a glorious time. And so kind of, I have to say personally, walking in Pristina, the capital, holding hands with Bill Clinton, they had done a statue of me, fortunately on a pedestal, so it was taller. Then we went to visit his statue. But the whole thing was just remarkable and made me think about, in some ways, also a moonshot, to do something right, to use our power to do good things for people and try to figure out what America's role in the world is. So,
I was in school at the time, and I was working actually with a handful of Serbs.
They don't like me anymore.
Well, those students, they were all PhD students,
Yes.
and they totally got it, and they were surprisingly supportive, given the other dynamics there. So,
well, I really, it's interesting because some of the younger Serbs are grateful, the older ones are not. But one of the things I have to say, it's very egotistical of me, but there's a whole generation of little girls, or now older girls, in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine. And so but it was the right thing to do. And I think it's something so germane about what America's role is and when do we do to help people and how we use the incredible power that we have. So
that's always a fine line, lots of that.
yeah, that. So it's my turn to ask you a question. So as a material scientist who could choose to pursue an awful lot of different things, I would like to know how you kind of focused on the issues that you've been working on, and the hardest thing of all, I think, that humanity faces today, which is the abundance of drinking water. And so, and I just think it would be very interesting if you could tell us a little bit more about how you really worked on renewables and all the various aspects of that.
Yeah, happy to. I think probably most people appreciate this, and I think people around here would call it a wicked problem, right? That water is in fact a wicked problem, and it is that for a whole bunch of reasons. You think about the fact that there are still 1 million miles of lead pipes in the U.S. Most of that's in buildings. You think about the cost of remediating that, it's untenable, right? There are over 750
water main breaks in the US a day. Right? And every single time one of those happens, in principle, there should be a boil advisory. I don't believe there are 750 boil advisories a day in the US. At a global level, it turns out that one person dies from waterborne illness every 10 seconds. So how many people have passed away from waterborne illness just since we've been sitting here? And then you think about on the sort of the female empowerment side, just in Africa alone, 40 billion hours a year spent fetching water. So, it's sort of, in my mind, we have this incredible brain trust globally, both in academia and in the technology space. And a lot of times that energy gets put into frivolous things. And so why don't we take that brain trust and focus it on some of the hardest things, right? And you think about the smartphone. The iPhone came out in, is it 2007 or 2008, 2007? Something like that. So literally we're a dozen years since the beginning of that. There are now 5 billion of those around the planet. Information poverty is essentially a thing of the past. Almost everybody on the planet either has one or knows somebody who has one. And so we've seen the many positive things that have come out of that and the few kind of dramatic negative things that have come out of that evolution. At the same time, renewable energy has gone down in cost by a factor of 10, thanks to many people in this room who have worked extensively to go do that. And yet, water poverty, if I can sort of invent a term, has gotten a lot worse in that same period. And gotten worse because of all the megatrends, right? Pollution, water overdraws, aging infrastructure, climate change, all of those things all contribute in the wrong direction. And so at a fundamental level, the question was, how can we go solve this given our thinking about things from a renewable energy perspective?
Well, can you go into this a little bit more in terms of just the renewable part? How does it really work? And help me understand some of what your options are to make water renewable. Isn't water already renewable? So, and a lot in terms of the engineering aspect of this. By the way, you said this is your water.
Yeah, this is our water. This is the Sonoran Desert dispensed in liquid form. Here you go.
But I really do think some of the conversations that we had in Aspen had to do with your explaining the process, and I think it's so incredible. So if you could do that, I think that would be terrific.
So you think about, in many ways, this is a wet planet. All the water that will ever be here is already here, right? There's water everywhere. But the problem is it's not always where you need it, and sometimes it's too much where you are, and it's often not in the condition that you need, right? And so that becomes this massive problem that is basically intractable because it always has to be customized for where you are. And it's sort of an extractive natural resource. You're pulling it out of the ground or pulling it off of a river, and you're by definition removing something that was there. From a renewables perspective, when all of us in the room think about renewable energy, we think about wind and solar and batteries and those sorts of things, which is really saying renewable electricity. But only about 20% of the global energy mix is electricity. The rest is in transportation, and the stuff you buy, embedded in the stuff you buy, energy it takes to make those things, in the food you eat and in the water you drink. And so if we really want to have a sustainable future, we have to get on moving from renewable energy just being electricity to renewable resources broadly. Because as we continue to get ever more penetration with electricity, that's great, but it's just a small piece of the total pie. And so that's what got us going down this path of saying, well, if we could do for water what solar did for electricity, we could go change the world.
So how do you do it?
How do we do it? So at a very basic level, think about what happens to sugar in a sugar bowl when you leave the lid off. Gets a little,
Somebody eats it.
gets a little clumpier. That's also true.
You're dealing
point.
with a political scientist, not
Fair point. So the sugar gets a little bit clumpy, right? And it does that because it's absorbing water vapor from the air. And in the same way that your wooden furniture in the summer absorbs water, and then in the winter it can crack because it shrinks, right? So there's experiences in our daily lives with materials that are, the scientific term is hygroscopic, that like water vapor from the air. And so what we went and did is develop a set of nanostructured materials that do that process really fast. And then we use sunlight to basically drive that water vapor back off of those materials and produce effectively distilled water almost anywhere on the planet. We then take that pure water, which is now like a clean slate, we mineralize it, and then store it on board. So every single panel is like an independent water supply. And then we can put these panels together in large arrays to serve everything from schools to hospitals to homes to whole communities.
Well, an incredible process. And, and you have just, when you were talking earlier, you've added now to something that I like to say. I always talk now about the role that technology has played in our world. And I have talked about often the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to walk tons of miles to pay her bills. She can do it with her mobile phone. I'm now going to add that what you're doing in terms of she doesn't have to go get the water all the time. So it is really the incredible aspect of the good things that technology has done for us. At some point we can talk about the bad things, but the bottom line is it really has changed people's lives in many ways. I'm just repeating some of the things because we spend a lot of time together in Aspen. And by the way, those of you who don't know what the Henry Crown Fellowship is, it is to people that are already somehow doing something useful, but urges them to do something more in terms of kind of a moonshot, frankly.
Yeah.
And this is something that you did, and it's really terrific to be part of that Henry Crown Fellowship. I've always been interested in trying to figure out a little bit how to level the playing field, and so your technology with the hydro panels are truly the ultimate example of using technology for social equity. And my question is, how do you make that realistic for a for-profit company that has investors whose job it is to make significant returns? So how does that work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So this concept of technology for social equity, right, implies that there is some kind of dislocation, some kind of gap that can be filled by technology in a general sense. And when we talk about water, it is this mass customization problem. What works in Toledo is not going to work in Cape Town, is not going to work in Jakarta, is not going to work in Paris, right? And it's because of pollution and because of heavy metals that may be dissolved in that water. It is because of wherever it has to be pumped from and so on. And so there's sort of this problem that every single time that you want to expand the drinking water capacity in a place, it turns into this massive challenge. And so the opportunity is one of getting onto a Moore's Law type learning curve, right? This Moore's Law concept that applies to how computers are getting faster and why solar panels get cheaper and so on, because you can centralize and develop a technology that can be repeated many, many, many times. And so you get the benefit of scale, you get the benefit of sort of data-driven learning cycles that accelerate. And so by doing what we've done with source hydro panels, it takes away that mass customization problem. It's the exact same panel now in 33 countries across dozens and dozens and dozens of types of applications at hundreds of different sites. And it's all the same panel. And so it removes that mass customization factor. And what it also means is that often we're lower cost today than many of those installations, many of the current incumbent, whatever that mechanism is that they're getting good water, whether they're filtering or trucking it in or having to do some kind of desal or whatever the case may be. The drivers are economic, and the business, on the business side of zero mass water, it is all about going and solving those problems at a scale that makes sense for those people, and at a scale that ultimately will make our stakeholders ever wealthier, right? Because ultimately, capitalism, while as imperfect as it is the ultimate way to scale, because capital begets capital when something makes money. And so that kind of application of developing technologies that lift people up into a space where there's clear stress. You can't move water very far. It's heavy, it's wet, it leaks, stuff grows in it, all the problems. So it's kind of a very local problem. We can go in and fundamentally change that and ultimately effectively digitize water wherever we are.
I think what's interesting in terms of the way you described it and the way I started it out in terms of leveling the playing field, but the bottom line, again, it's interesting, political science is a different kind of science. And the thing, relating it to two different things that I'm involved in. You introduced me as being chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. And one of the issues always is how do you help people have the kind of government they need? And when I went to graduate school in the different science, what happens is you talk about what comes first, political development or economic development. And they have to go together, because for democracy to succeed, it has to deliver. Right. And so, and people want to vote and eat or drink water. And so I think it is a very important aspect in terms of helping people to be able to have some influence on their governments and to try to figure out how that all really works. The other part, I think, in terms of investing, again, described, I'm very interested in emerging markets, and emerging markets are a little iffy, but the bottom line is if you are actually delivering something that people need, yeah, capitalism does work. Right. And so I do think that the combination of the various things that you are doing through this incredible invention and your scientific brilliance, I think, is just great. And so I wanted to actually ask you the secret here, that as part of the MIT Lemelson recognition, you're going to receive $500,000 cash gift. And so, knowing who you are, really, can you share us a little bit about how you're going to use that money? Sure. Not buying a Ferrari, although I thought about it for a second. It's such a great honor, and it's been a huge team effort. And keep in mind, I'm not going to receive, in a paper check inside of an envelope with no blinking over the check, $500K came to the front door, which is a little weird, right? Yeah. I'm holding this up and going, wow, this made this here. Yeah. And so, starting to think about how do we honor the gift that is that award? How do we think about what source represents, and how do we sort of turn that back to the world? And so I called up my buddy, she's the president of Conservation International. Her name is Jen Morris, and I whispered in her ear about the prize, and I said, hey, where could we go have an impact on an indigenous community that themselves are doing something for the world, right? And as we know, 70% of the natural world that's left is controlled and managed by indigenous populations around the world. So we need to do right by our indigenous peoples, right? And so in Guajira, Colombia, there is an area called Bahia Honduita, and it's occupied by the Wagyu people. And it's an extraordinarily arid place. And Conservation International had gone in there before and looked at possibly doing small-scale desal or some other mechanism to provide these people water, because their historical source of water, which was a river, has been dammed up, problematic, as you can imagine. And so they don't receive that water anymore, and so they have a massive issue. And at the same time, these are people who have gone from, over the last decade, from eating sea turtles as a cultural practice to committing not to save them. And so
we are going to solve their drinking water problem with that gift and eliminate waterborne illnesses from those folks. That's what we're doing.
Well, that's amazing. That's great. Yeah.
It's one of the many reasons why building this company has been just so absolutely humbling. Is it seems like once a week, we'll get an image from some far-flung place that now has water that didn't before, and it's either the people there are funding it, or a influencer of one sort or another, an athlete or a actor or a rapper or whoever the people may be, are choosing to engage and be a part of this story and help deploy, right? And so it's one of the really kind of unexpected things building kind of this concept of technology for social equity was that, especially early on, you'd hear, well, is this a business or is this philanthropy? What is this? And I would say, well, that's entirely the wrong question. We'll make money, right? We'll make a lot of money, but isn't this about advancing humanity in some way? And if it makes sense to solve their problems, whatever they're doing right now, because obviously they have to have some kind of water, right? That has to have a certain cost, and if we can solve for that cost, then we'll make money and they'll want it, right? And it's been just amazing to see kind of that come to fruition without having to sort of have this concept of a balance between philanthropy and running a capitalistic business. In fact, you can have them both in spades if you're solving problems.
Benjamin Franklin said, doing well by doing good.
Exactly.
I think that's
Yeah. So, I think, so Secretary Albright, I think everyone here appreciates your wisdom. And before we go to the open question session, I'd love to get your thoughts on where you're most excited about, and not source. We already did the plug.
Yeah.
Where you're most excited about technology meeting sort of diplomatic capacity building. Where do you see over the next few years opportunities, or where the world's going to go on that front?
Well, we are, the world's a mess. That's a diplomatic term of art. But I think the things that, just to stay with the subject in many ways, there is no question in my mind that if we're fighting over oil now, we are going to be fighting over water more. Because it is absolutely essential for life. And so the whole question about how you understand the issue of lack of water as a national security issue in a number of ways. And we do know that some of the fighting that's gone on already, in Sudan, for instance, was when the people were not able, in Darfur, were being pushed out. There wasn't water. They had to leave. Any number of different aspects, or the Middle East, which is complicated enough, but the water issues are very great there. I think the question then becomes one of, from a diplomatic perspective, how do you help countries, the leaders of countries, to understand the importance of investing in some kind of a way of dealing with the water issue? Then also very specific things to do with water in terms of how rivers are controlled, what's the international law about that, or the law of the sea, or any number of different ways that diplomacy becomes a very important tool. I do teach at Georgetown, and I say, when I begin my course, I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox. And I taught yesterday about the importance of bilateral diplomacy. How do you, in fact, develop a system where you, as X country, can talk to another one on the basis of some kind of a common interest? And if dealing with trying to provide water becomes something that is wanted by both sides, it's obviously easier. But if there is fighting over, whose river it really is, or should you be involved in some country's political affairs, then it really does require the art of diplomacy, and we have to see that in many different ways. And so I think that the things that people might not think we have anything in common, but I do think that in fact the art that you have produced is something, and the mechanism is something that can be very useful and important in deflecting fighting.
Right.
And trying to figure out how to make things better. One of the aspects now, obviously, is also immigration.
Right.
People don't want to leave the country where they're born because of language and family, but if they are dying, starving, can't drink water, their children are dying of disease, then it also becomes something that helps to solve those problems. So I see the combination of technology and national security issues as working together rather than opposed to each other.
Yep.
Now, there are aspects about technology which has its downside, and it has mostly to do with the fact that information technology, where is it that people get their information, and that as a result of social media, everybody kind of lives in their own little world and get their information through ways that they don't know really where it comes from. And so I do think that we need to recognize that both the positive sides of technology can produce negative, and so there also has to be diplomatic or action on that. So, for instance, I often talk about the downside of it in terms of the Arab Spring. So what happened, people were summoned to Tahrir Square by social media in Cairo. They all got their information in some specific way to motivate them, but they weren't organized. And what happens with information technology, it disaggregates people so that they aren't forming political parties. Then what happens is that in Egypt's example, the elections were held too soon. The Muslim Brotherhood was organized. The people in Tahrir Square were not, and so the Muslim Brotherhood wins the election. Things turn out to be very bad, complicated. Then I make up this guy who's a middle-aged guy who lives outside of Cairo who wants to come in and open his stall in the marketplace, and Cairo's a mess, and he says, to hell with this. I want order. And now they have a military government. And so there are various aspects to technology that have their downside. Then this is it's a plagiarized line, but I use it all the time, which is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. And so the governments aren't functioning to deal with the various problems. So I prefer to look at the upside of technology, and what you're doing is a perfect example of that. But I think we do need to recognize that it is not perfect. It has displaced people from their jobs, and it does have this other problem. But I wasn't going to raise this, but because I love to connect dots, and water and indigenous peoples. So I was just in Oregon, and I was taken to the Oregon Historical Society, and they have a whole issue where they dammed the Columbia River, displacing our indigenous peoples. And I have rarely been to a place that has such social guilt as all the people that were there listening to what was going on in Oregon, and how one really deals with this in terms of that you think you're doing some good by damming a river, and it turns out that you've hurt a lot of different people. And so I do think it's important as we look at policies, or what are the unintended consequences of what we do, which is hard, frankly, but I think very much kind of thing that you've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talk about inside of Zero Mass is that the technology is 2% of the solution, no more.
Yeah.
98% is building community, finding partners, working to build this solution with the people that are there, wherever they are, whatever it is, whether it's a $10 million house in Berkeley Hills or an orphanage for Syrian refugees in northern Lebanon. We need to go in and understand what the real issue is. Now, in some ways, it's very simple, right? Oh, they need drinking water. Well, okay. But what are the drivers? What are the cultural issues? How do we make sure that we do it right? And that takes just one extra beat, right, than just running in.
Yeah.
And that extra beat is often where you find the solution. The technology is necessary, but far, far, far from sufficient. And so I think it's a lesson learned from many of the other, many of the historical examples. You are famous for your brooches.
I am, yes. Why am I wearing diamonds in the middle at 9 o'clock
Exactly
in
what
the
I was
morning?
thinking.
So this was a present just given to me by the library, and it is a replica of a pin that Jackie Kennedy wore. But it was given to me with a little note that says it reminded the giver of the sun, and that is an essential part of your technology. So I'm happy to have it for the Kennedy part,
Yes.
but also to kind of be a good memory of what we've done here.
Wonderful.
By the way, the reason I'm known for my pins, just so you know what
Yeah,
happened,
this is a great, you got to tell the
is
story.
that I clearly like jewelry. So I was first ambassador to the United Nations, and it was right after the Gulf War in '93, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was an instructed ambassador, and my job was to make sure that the sanctions stayed on. So I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein every day. He deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. So all of a sudden there was a poem in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. And so I happened to have had a snake pin, and I decided to wear it whenever we talked about Iraq. And I think you've noticed how when the ambassadors leave the meeting, the press is there, so a camera zeroes in and says, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" So I said, because Saddam Hussein had compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to depict whatever it was I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, I wore a lot of carnivorous animals and various things. And the other ambassadors kind of began to get the message, and they would say, "What are we going to redo today?" And I said, "Read my pins." And that's how it started. And they got used to it. So, for instance, just as an example, when I was Secretary of State, the Russians were actually bugging a room in the State Department. And we found the guy who was sitting outside listening. We did what diplomats do, which is demarche Moscow. But the next time I met with the Russian foreign minister, I wore this huge bug, and he knew exactly the message that I was sending. So I've had a lot of fun with it.
Wonderful.
But, yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think we have a couple mobile mics. Questions? Wasselu.
Good morning, Madam Secretary.
Hello?
Madam Friesen? No? Secretary Friesen? Can you just repeat the technology, 18th century technology, we're speaking to him in 23rd technology, so I can write that down?
Oh, the plagiarized line?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Wasselu, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah.
So-
I'm Wasselu Jaco. I'm one of the investors in Zero Mass, and I'm also sit on the advisory board for articulation for young Cody Friesen right there. So
The truth is, it really summarizes things very well, which is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. And it is really an example of the fact that our institutions lack credibility now because they are not providing the answers that are needed in modern society. But it does kind of summarize it well. But you can't quote me. You have to say it's plagiarized from Silicon Valley. Yeah.
Wasselu is also a Henry Crown Fellow,
Well,
Yeah.
very good. Great.
so you'll see him around announcement.
Good morning, Madam Secretary, and thank you, Doctor. Patrick Kearney. I am a 24-year-old recently elected state representative from Marshfield and Scituate. And I'm really happy to be here today because I have a huge water problem in Scituate. I have 63 miles of asbestos concrete pipe. I have people that are trying to mix baby formula with brown water that has iron and high manganese counts and all sorts of stuff. So I wanted to ask both of you, on the back of what you had just said, Madam Secretary, how do you balance your political career and your messaging when there are people with undrinkable water And how do you say to them, we might need to raise taxes, water rates are going to go up? How do you balance housing affordability with trying to also deliver to people clean water? And delivering on that might mean they're paying more for the water that's unusable.
Well, I think one of the really, by the way, I have only one regret in life, which is that I didn't run for office. And you are doing a huge public service, and I really admire people that really get out there and do it. And especially the younger generation. And so I've always thought that the hard part, but the essential part, is to have honest conversations with one's constituents. And it requires longer than, if I may say, just some debate where you raise your hand. And try to explain that paying taxes is the price of living in a civilized society. And that one gets things for it. But I think it takes a lot of time and then kind of the trust that you have to develop with your constituents in order for them to understand what you're saying, and not talking down to them, but to really bring them into the story, and especially at the local level. I mean, I think the strength of democracy is the local level more and more, because it goes back to the statement is that the only, as far as I can tell, the only level of people that actually have the trust of the people are people that are local, mayors, state councils, state representatives, that really have the opportunity to talk to their constituents and take their advice and not just tell them what they should do. And so it would be that kind of, and one of the things, by the way, I did write this book that has this bland title, Fascism, A Warning. And one of the things that, we have the saying, see something, say something. I have added to that, do something. And on my to-do list is for people to run for office, or in those of us that aren't, to be supportive. And then something that I think is really hard is to talk to people with whom you disagree. I don't like the word, not tolerate them, not put up with them, but really try to find out what is motivating them and have respectful conversations. And then you fit this, which is, there's not a book or a speech ever given that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So a quote that I like goes something like, the older I am, the younger are my teachers.
I have to follow that answer. So I'd say, I think, well, first of all, water is a massive infrastructure challenge. And of course, what it would cost you to actually go and remediate all of those asbestos pipes, whatnot, it's obviously outside the scope of what's possible. And so I agree with the Secretary. It's going to take a lot of sort of very carefully thought out messaging over a long period of time. But I think what you'll find is that many of the people in your area are probably not drinking that water. They're probably buying bottled water, or have some higher end filters or some other things trying to solve for that problem. And so their real water cost, by the time it gets to their cup, is actually really high, okay? And so solutions like Source can often be lower cost than that when we're talking about drinking and cooking water. And so we're happy to help you out with that. And Rob Bartrop, sitting over here, can help you. He's our Chief Revenue Officer. Just wave. He's the one Australian in the room. Can't miss him. Yep.
I believe we've got time for one more.
Okay.
I'm originally from Michigan, and I grew up around Flint, Michigan, a place with deep water disparities. And recently, people have been talking about the environment and dynamics of socioeconomics and racism and environmentalism. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect on a place like Flint, Michigan, and some of the deep inequalities that brought about really an epic water problem in a very developed part of our country.
Yeah. Let me break it into two pieces on the problem side, because I think a lot gets lost in the issues, right? So all that happened was there's lead oxide inside these lead pipes. All that happened is the pH just moved a little bit, just got a little bit acidic, and that flushed all that lead into the pipes. Tiny little thing, a poor decision, but a small thing. Where the endemic racism came in and those other things were the hiding of that fact and the fact that it's still not solved, right? That wouldn't happen in many other towns that look different than Flint. And so water is this sort of very intrinsically hard problem, and yet it can be solved with better stewardship of the systems, and can be solved with technology in a way that doesn't invoke 19th century type approaches. With, for example, a source, every single panel is cloud connected. You can see on your source app that not only do you have a certain amount of water, but it's been ozonated, meaning that it's sterile. You know the level of mineralization, et cetera. So for the first time your water is digitized, you know exactly where it came from, and you've disintermediated all of that infrastructure. I saw my son have his hand up, so I just want to take the question from him.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alden. We need a microphone down here if we could. Thank you. Sorry.
No, I was going to say we needed to do that. Yes.
Excuse me, Madam Secretary Albright. How many brooches /and/or pins do you have?
Well, I don't know. I'll tell you what has happened. The reason that I have been even interested in them and saved them is that they all have foreign policy stories. And so there's been a show going around with about 200 pins that all have foreign policy stories. And it allows me to make foreign policy less foreign. And those are the ones that have gone around, and I can talk about the Middle East peace process as a result of my pins. So on crabs, because people get angry, or various other animals that I have, or talk about people that I've met as a result of my pins, pins that have gotten me into trouble. When I wore 3 monkeys to Russia because I was doing the Hear No Evil, See No Evil monkeys, and President Putin said to President Clinton, "We always notice what pins Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those monkeys?" And I actually said, because I think your policy in Chechnya is evil, and he got furious at me. Clinton looked at me like, "Are you out of your mind? You're the chief diplomat and you've just screwed up the summit." But I'm able to talk about things like that, and so I'm going to give that whole collection. The State Department has established a diplomacy museum, and I'm going to give those pins there so that they can be used to tell stories, and also good for geography and learning the names of leaders. But I've had a lot of fun with my pins, and I always like new ones. So thank you.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Okay, so wow, what a humbling audience, and it's been just a terrific honor to share the dais with the first woman Secretary of State in the United States. What a wonderful pleasure, and always wonderful talking to you. And what a honor to be here in a place honoring a man who I think demonstrates the best of what this country should be all about. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Yeah. Please stay seated while I escort the secretary out, and then we'll see you out there.
Well, let me, Cody, say one
please.
more. I mean, truly, congratulations
Thank
to you and for what you have done and what you will keep doing.
Thank you.
Because I think that you're always looking forward and looking at other things. And I'm happy to finally understand how this works. So thank you very, very much, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to give you a hug. Wonderful. Nice job.
Great. Yeah. Good. Where are we going? Up?
I think we're going up.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Great. Wow, that was fun. Yeah. Okay. Let's do that.